Thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, and the name of that YouTube channel, if anyone wants to know, is Lifting the Lamp. So if you type that into YouTube, you'll be able to find it. So, thank you all for coming. It's quite a good turnout. This is the first public talk that I've given on a spiritual topic, so it's very exciting for me as well. And I wanted to talk about something which was going to be relevant to the times that we're living in now. And if you look at the state of the world, it's clear that things are pretty chaotic. There's a lot of upheaval going on in a lot of ways that are unprecedented. And there's a lot of people asking why. Why is there so much going on in the world at the moment where it seems like everything's being turned upside down? People are talking about how these are apocalyptic times and all sorts of things like that. So it can be distressing to live in these sorts of periods of history, but there's also a way that we can understand the challenging state of the world today where we can have a deeper understanding of what's going on in terms of the world. Human history moves through cycles, and we are approaching the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. And so when you understand the times we're living in now in those terms, there's a silver lining, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, there's cause for hope at the end of it, our new beginning. And I've selected a quote here which I think encapsulates the topic of tonight and also the incredible time we find ourselves in. And this is from the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who said, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born." Okay, so there are lots of different ways that people have tried to interpret the different cycles of human history, the way that the ancients have tried to systematize or interpret the different stages of human development. And in Near Eastern cultures of the past, which is where a lot of Western societies come from, the ancients looked at the great ages of the earth through the lens of astrology. We think of astrology in terms of the horoscope in the newspaper each week, predicting what's going to happen for individuals in the week to come. But there's another scale of astrology which tries to make predictions about what the next 2,000 years is going to look like, and the next several thousand years is going to look like. And when it comes to astrology, personally I find the idea of astrology a bit preposterous. I'm very scientifically minded, so there's certain things about astrology that I find difficult to accept, but somehow it seems to make accurate predictions. I've had my natal chart read. I don't know why, but it describes everything that's happened to me, even when I've tried to resist it. So there's something to it, and there's something about astrology and the different signs and movements in and out of the different signs that ancient peoples were able to use to describe the cycles of humanity. So, how are the astrological ages calculated? This bit is a bit technical. So I've got a prop, which is the globe. So we think about the astrological signs in terms of, the way that astrology is normally used. There's the year, 365 days roughly of every year, divided into 12 segments throughout the year, about 1 month in length each. But there's a different cycle that the Earth goes through astronomically, where it moves through each sign on a much larger time scale. And this is called the sidereal year, or the great year. It lasts for about 2,160 years, that is to say each distinct age, lasts for 2,160 years, and there's 12 in total, for a total of about 26,000 years for a great year of the Earth. And the way that this is calculated is, if you've ever seen an old globe, you'll notice that it's on a slight tilt, and there's a reason for this, because the Earth's axis is actually at a 23.5 degree angle. It's not straight up like that. And so the effect of this is that when the Earth is revolving through space, it's wobbling on this slightly askew axis. Like if you spin a spinning top at an angle and the top starts to wobble. The Earth is doing this, but it's a very slow wobble. It takes 26,000 years to go all the way around. And so what this means, as the Earth is moving through space, revolving around the sun, is once the Earth gets back to where it was a year ago, in that year, it's tilted slightly. And the effect that has in terms of human beings looking up at the sky is that the night sky has shifted slightly like this. And so what that means is if it's March 21st and a year has gone by and it's March 21st again, and you're watching the sun rise on the morning of the equinox, then you will see the sun rise at a different point in the constellations than you would the previous year. And if you were to watch the sun rise on the March equinox 2,000 years ago, it would be where that line is between Pisces and Aries. If you were to watch the same sunrise on the same day 150 or so years from now, it would be at that point between where Pisces and Aquarius are. So that is the sidereal year, and that point of the vernal equinoctial point is the point which moves through the signs, and that's how we calculate the astrological ages. Now, that's all well and good, but how do we know where we are in the cycle? There's no agreement on this, and there's different people who calculate the beginning of each age differently, but there's a few hints that will get us in the ballpark. One of the most reliable of these is the observation made by Hipparchus of Nicaea, who was an ancient Greek astronomer who in 130 BCE identified the first point in Aries. He observed at that time that we were talking about, March 21st, at sunrise, that the sun rose in the sign of Aries in 130 BCE, and it had moved slightly closer to Pisces and was just about to cross over into Pisces, and he called this the first point in Aries. So if we were on the verge of entering Pisces from Aries in 130 BCE, and we've got ages of about 2,160 years each, then you can see how around the start of the Common Era, we would be entering the age of Pisces. And that brings me to my next point, because one of the ways that we can understand the beginning of the age that we're in now is something that it's really taken for granted. It's right in front of our eyes. So that is the year. What year is it by our calendar? It's 2022. What? The year of our Lord, 2022 years since the birth of Jesus. Well, it may well not have, but there's this point in history that is identified as the beginning of a new age, and we have calculated our calendar based on that. And there's hints to suggest that the person who came up with the calendar that we follow now, which for whatever reason starts at that date of 1 AD, actually based his calculations off the precession of the equinoxes. because nobody actually agreed when Jesus was born once upon a time. There were people who thought that he was born 500 years earlier. And the calculation that was used for when he was supposed to be born was based on when the age of Pisces was supposed to begin. According to this person's calculations, Dionysius Exiguus. And that's where we get the Common Era from. That's where we get our modern calendar from. So, and that's measured astrologically. And so, as I've said, this is not an exact calculation. It's a ballpark calculation. But in a way, that's not important because we have what's called a cusp in between one age and the next. And what that means is there's always a transition period. So the beginning of one age and the end of the other, it's not like the new year where you count down to midnight and then suddenly you're in a new year. It's more like the seasons. Like you think about where we are now in the seasonal cycle. If you follow the European seasons, which doesn't always fit with this part of the world, but for argument's sake, we're supposed to be in winter right now. There's been some very long, dark nights. It's been very cold, but we're starting to see now, we're about a month out from September, and we're starting to see that, well, a little less than a month now, but we're starting to see that it's starting to warm up a bit, and can see the beginnings of spring starting to creep in. And it's like that with the ages. We're starting to see, when there's a cusp of the ages, we start to see little things that indicate a new way of being for humanity sort of seeping into the existing status quo. And we start to see a change gradually occurring, which usually takes decades, sometimes centuries. Okay, so that's the theory of the ages, but what evidence do we have from archaeology, from anthropology that indicates that the ancient peoples actually had some understanding of this, even if it was just a few hidden mystery traditions within those cultures? Well, there's quite a few references that we can see. If you start from the most ancient of the ages, the Age of Taurus, which was about 4,200-ish years ago, through to about just under 4,200-ish years before the Common Era, I should say, to about just over 2,000 years before the Common Era. We've got a lot of bull symbolism. The bull was considered a sacred animal in that particular time in history in many cultures, such as the Minoans, who practiced the sacred ceremony of bull leaping. We have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which involves the bull of heaven being subdued by Gilgamesh, and in fact that myth was written down close to the transition to the Age of Aries. So perhaps there is some symbolism in the bull being subdued by the hero of the story. In the further east, in ancient India, we've got the story of Krishna, and Krishna is always depicted with a bull, the sacred bull, which is revered even today in Hinduism, and he was a cowherd before he reclaimed his place as a prince. So again, we see this bull symbolism, and the alleged birth date of Lord Krishna, Vedic astrologers have calculated according to a rare planetary alignment that's mentioned in the Mahabharata, and it's about 3,200 BC. I can't remember the exact date, but it's within the Taurus age astrologically. So that's another interesting coincidence. And then in terms of the age that followed the age of Taurus, it was the Age of Aries. This is Aries the ram. Do we see anything in ancient cultures to indicate that they understood a transition to that age was occurring? Well, we do. In Egypt, this is the temple at Karnak. This picture down the bottom, the row of statues, these are ram-headed sphinxes. And what the ram represents here is the Egyptian god Amun, the ram-headed god. And even though the Egyptians were a polytheistic society, there were times in history where one cult would become dominant and rise above all the others. And in this period, beginning around 2,000 years before the Common Era, we saw the rise of the cult of Amun, which then in the subsequent centuries became the dominant cult of Egypt. And Amun was the ram-headed god. So one of the biggest sources of astrological references is actually the Bible, which is surprising given how hostile certain churches are to astrology. The Bible is actually full of astrological symbolism. You almost can't understand it without astrology. You look at the fact that there's 12 of everything. There's the 12 tribes of Israel. There's the 12 apostles. There's 12 signs of the zodiac. There's the four-headed cherubs. There's the four angels around the throne of God, who each have a different face, which roughly equate to the four fixed signs of the zodiac. I mean, it's just everywhere. And we can also track the transition from one age to next in the Bible as well. So I've put a few examples up here. Abraham, who was born approximately 2,000 years before Christ, again, around in the ballpark of when the Age of Aquarius would have begun. What was he famous for? Well, he began a new covenant with a new God, and the way that he inaugurated that was by sacrificing a ram in the thicket, so a symbol of Aries. And the ram's horn went on to become a symbol of the ancient Israelites, who began to arise around that time. And then you've got the story of Moses, which is usually dated to about 1200 BCE, sometimes earlier, where we see the growth of this new religious impulse, and then a pivotal point in the story where Moses is delivered a new law, and the golden calf, which represents the previous forms of worship, is destroyed. The calf, of course, being a symbol for Taurus. So again, we have symbolism of Taurus giving way to Aries. And if you want to go even deeper, I don't want to focus too much on this because there's just not enough time, but the Israelites weren't always a monotheistic people. They were actually polytheists for most of their history. And the main deity that they worshipped at first was El, who was an agricultural deity, who was later, appropriately enough in the Age of Aquarius, superseded by a new god, Yahweh, who was a war god, who later became the only god as ancient Israelite religion evolved into monotheism. So again, we see a more Taurian energy being replaced by a more Aries-oriented energy. And in the New Testament, we see more astrological symbolism. So this symbol here, the fish, is so well known as a symbol for Jesus and for Christianity. It's also the symbol for Pisces. It's the sign of the fish. And the reason why, as our discussion about the Common Era shows, is because the beginning of the Common Era, the era that we're in now, is the age of Pisces. And the birth of Jesus, the story of the birth of Jesus, marks the beginning of the age of Pisces, which is why he has so much fish symbolism in what he does. The fishermen being his first disciples, miracles revolving around fish. It's just fish symbolism everywhere, because he was the avatar of Pisces. And there's even references in the Bible to a concept of history which involves consecutive ages, which is what I've quoted up here with Matthew 28, verse 20. It's not talking about the end of the world, as that verse is sometimes interpreted as. It's talking about the end of one age and the beginning of the next, which is a much different kind of idea. And then in Luke 22, verse 10, which is about the instructions Jesus gives to prepare for the Last Supper, he tells his disciples to go meet a man carrying a pitcher of water. And this can be interpreted as giving a message that the age after the one that Jesus has inaugurated will be the age of the water carrier, the age of Aquarius. And of course, if we look at the zodiac, we know that that is the case. So these stories are full of this hidden symbolism which relates to the signs of the zodiac. So that's how we can track in history how the ages have unfolded in the Near East. What do the ages actually mean? The age of Taurus, with a start date and an end date there, that's one person's idea of when the start and end date is, and it's measuring it in a slightly smaller time scale, but it's pretty close. So the age of Taurus, starting here 4,300 BCE, ending 2,150 BCE, is a time where we see the rise of urban civilizations. Agricultural society that's been around for thousands of years finally gives rise to a really settled society, a really developed, domesticated society, where there's the use of animal husbandry, including the domestication of bulls and other animals, agriculture, the beginning of societies in what is called the cradle of civilization. And Taurus is very much a sign of settling down. It's an earthy sign, and it represents becoming grounded in earthy things, in physical things. The subsequent age of Aries, here listed as 2150 BCE and starting at that time and ending 1 CE, this was a time of empires rising and falling. We saw subsequent ancient empires arising, such as the Egyptians, then the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, all overtaking one another and all expanding their empire through war and bloodshed. And this very much matches with the energy of Aries, which is a very warlike sign, and also a very fiery sign. And then Pisces, from 1 CE to about 2150 CE on these calculations, is a time where we have a completely new kind of religion arising, particularly Christianity, but either side of that, in the 500 or so years either side of the beginning of the Common Era, we see in India and in China, Buddha was born, Lao Tzu was born, and Confucius was born about 500 years before the Common Era. And then a few hundred years after Christianity, we see in Arabia Muhammad beginning the religion of Islam. And these new religions were a new form of religion that were universalist in nature. They professed to have universal truths, but they were also very idealist. They, to a large extent, rejected the physical world and looked to something purely spiritual as something to be striven towards. And so that kind of head in the clouds, otherworldliness from the physical world is a very Piscean kind of aspect. So again, we see that reflected in the transition through the different ages. So that brings us to Aquarius. So what's that going to look like? Even though I've selected certain images here, it's not going to be a utopia, so don't be too misled by that. But Helena Blavatsky believed that it was going to be a kind of a golden age, so certainly an improvement on what we have today. And it's supposed to be a time of great technological advancement and also a time of greater spirituality. It's not all good, I'll get to that, but broadly speaking, what are the attributes of Aquarius? Well, Aquarius is a very revolutionary sign, so it's very focused on freedom, independence, liberation, and it's a very humanitarian sign, and it's a sign that is seen as very creative, so is often seen as corresponding with science, technology, innovation, invention, It's a very intellectual sign, so it's seen associated with the proliferation of knowledge and the accumulation of knowledge. And linked to, the humanitarian idea is the sort of interconnectedness of all people. You know, the Aquarius is a bit of a hippie and wants one world and all of that. And that's reflected in, this kind of principle of interconnectedness. But what are some of the not so helpful traits of Aquarius, the dark side of Aquarius, if you will? Well, we can see this playing out in the current times, much as with the positive qualities in certain manifestations. Social media addiction. The Aquarius can be so intellectual that they become obsessed with information and they become kind of trapped in it, which is reflected in the social media addiction of today's times. Conspiracy theories, fake news, can all be very, unflattering Aquarian kind of traits to believe such things and to be so eccentric that you sort of start to deviate from reality a bit. Fanaticism, political extremism. I mean, we live in a very polarized society today. Mental illness. Again, Aquarius is an airy sign. It's a sign of the intellect, and so it's interesting that so many of the health problems that are common today are mental illnesses. And of course, we saw globalism as one of the qualities in the left-hand column, as well as science and technology, but of course both of those things can have negative effects. Globalization has led to the exploitation of the developing world. Science has led to great advances, but it's also led to nuclear weapons and things of that nature. So there's always two sides to everything. This is again looking at the trends of the past century or so. As you could say that we're living in the cusp now. If the date of crossing over to Aquarius is, say, around 2160 AD, then that places us very much in the cusp right now. And you can see manifestations of that in history. This picture in the bottom left-hand corner, this is the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is just one example over the last century where authoritarian regimes have collapsed as people demand more rights. We've seen democracy grow in a really astonishing way in the past century or so, although the last 16 years we've seen a retreat of democracy. If you look at the long-term scale, there's a definite trend in a particular direction. The United Nations, a first or second attempt to create a united world. We see the emergence of a global society with the spread of globalization. And of course, we've got a modernized society, a more technological society. All of this was unheard of 100 or so years ago. So, the changes that have occurred over the past 100, 200 years are immense and unprecedented. But of course, the transition from one age to the next also means that it can have some unforeseen negative consequences. For one thing, the revolutionary spirit of Aquarius can want to get rid of so much tradition that it sometimes throws out the baby with the bathwater. So we see that in the form of rejecting so much of the past that we lose the values that we once held as a society, which perhaps some of which were outdated and needed to go, but some of them, such as looking after each other and social solidarity, perhaps were there for a reason, and it's a bit of a tragedy that they've been eroded so much. We see the manifestation of culture wars, which I kind of touched on before, but as you have this incoming new energy, this new impulse of humanity to be a different way, you're going to get pushback. You're going to get forces, groups that aren't happy about people wanting more freedom, and they want to push things back the other way. And we see that, we've seen that in the Supreme Court in the US recently. So it creates this dynamic of culture wars. And so that can be something that can really tear society apart from the inside. And sometimes, sometimes that kind of upheaval or radical change is necessary or to be expected, even in the cusp of an age. But it can also lead to a very fragmented society. And of course, being at the end of the age of Pisces, the institutions that dominated that era are very stagnant and very on their last legs, and so that means that they're not really serving us the way that they used to. We see corruption and things of that nature occurring in governments and just institutions which are trying to promote a view of the world that just most people don't adhere to anymore. This is particularly noticeable in religion, and I'll get to that. That's got a slide all of its own. But before I do move on to that, rapid change can be a good thing, but it can also lead to unforeseen consequences, especially if that change happens in a way that's unbalanced. So, for example, we have a more technological society. We've got more control over nature than we've ever had. And we've got incredible growth thanks to science and technology and innovation. But what that also leads to is environmental devastation. And as we emit more carbon into the atmosphere, it leads to climate change. As we encroach on more and more native habitats, it exposes us to new pathogens and leads to new pandemics, as we're well aware of over the past 2 years. We've got more wealth than ever before as a result of the modern economic system that we have, but that economic system also includes hierarchical elements to it, which means that all of that incredible wealth that is generated tends to go to one group more than anybody else. And so while we simultaneously have more wealth than ever before, we also have more inequality than ever before. So all of these things, they indicate the challenges of the transition and the fact that we need to iron out some of the contradictions that are sort of going through our society as we try and adjust to a new way of being as a species. So what does the cusp mean for spirituality? Because as the previous slides that I've shown demonstrate, religion and spirituality is one of the areas where the transition is felt the strongest. And we've seen that again during the last 100 years. And we see big changes in religion, as with other areas of life. So this photo here on the left, this is in 2013, early 2013. This is the day that Pope Benedict XVI resigned. It's the first pope to resign in 800 years. And on that day, a lightning bolt struck the Vatican. So to me, that seems like a bit of an omen. It's like the rending of the veil of the Holy of Holies 2.0. And perhaps it's a sign that if there is some kind of divine principle out there, perhaps the church is no longer in harmony with it. But if we look even at the last 100 years in terms of the number of people who identify as Christian, Christianity dominated the age of Pisces for the past 2,000 years, and now we're in a situation where over the last 100 years, the number of Christians has declined dramatically to the point where the census results for 2019, I think, or 2020, which were released earlier this year, show that for the first time in Australian history, there's actually not a Christian majority in Australia anymore. Since Australia was founded as a modern nation, of course, before Australia was colonised, it wasn't Christian. But for its modern history, it's always been a majority Christian country until today. And in the next few years, there'll probably be more people identifying as no religion than the overall people who identify as Christian in Australia. And it's reflected in lots of other developed countries as well. So this is a really new phenomenon in the last century or so where Christianity is in sharp decline. We also see the rise of new religious movements, new ways of relating to spirituality, new belief systems which put more of an emphasis on spiritual independence, on the importance of individuality, of individual autonomy, all very Aquarian impulses. And there's lots of different examples of that. Theosophy can be seen as an example of that. You know, Theosophy has only been around since the 1800s. And of course, the New Age movement. I mean, how much more obvious can you get? It's called the New Age movement. It is another manifestation of this new impulse that's emerging, and there will be, I'm sure that there will be other movements in the future which also embody this Aquarian ideal. But this is an example of the New Age movement here. This image on the right, this is the harmonic convergence. So there's probably some people in the room who remember it when it happened in 1987. I don't. This was a few years before I was born, so I wasn't around for it. But thousands of people gathered around the world at various sacred sites around the world to engage in group meditation and try and use intent to bring about the new age of Aquarius, to bring it into the world. So, you know, people are tapping into this new incoming spiritual impulse, and they're starting new movements around it. So again, we see the Aquarian age echoed in changes in religion and spirituality, and this could also be one day reflected in new religious teachers, the same way as it was with the beginning of the age of Pisces and even Aries. So that's all well and good, but so we've spoken about the astrological ages, what to expect based on astrology, what the trends look like if you prescribe to the theory of the great astrological ages. But there's a risk of getting a bit too fatalistic with this stuff, of just thinking, well, somehow the stars are in control, and if we just sit back, the age of Aquarius will come about all by itself. But that's not the case. We're part of the universe, we're not separate from it, and part of the change is the way that we engage with history and with the world. So ultimately, whatever the future looks like, whatever the next 150 years look like, will be up to us. It will be determined by the decisions we make as a species, and that will determine what this new age that we're entering looks like. And that is the slide that I wanted to finish on. So that's it. That's the astrological ages in a nutshell. Thank you, everybody.